podcast was created as a supplemental learning resource for our cognitive psychology course. The content is based on course topics and readings from Essentials of Cognitive Psychology by Christopher Klein, along with instructor-developed explanations, examples, and pedagogical framing. AI tools were used to help transform course material into a conversational podcast format, including the use of AI-generated voices. The use of AI voice technology is intended to make the material more engaging, accessible, and flexible for students. However, the podcast should not replace careful reading of the textbook, reviewing course materials, or completing assigned activities. Any interpretations, examples, or explanations included in the podcast are provided for educational purposes and are the responsibility of the instructor. Students should rely on the assigned textbook, course lectures, and official course materials as the primary sources for exams, assignments, and class discussions.
So, imagine I asked you to sit in a laboratory and read a list of scrambled words, just a standard language test.
Right, something very simple.
Exactly. And then after you finished, I thank you for your time, gave you your credit, and let you leave the room.
Standard protocol.
Yeah, but what you wouldn't know is that the words you just read, they actually secretly reprogrammed the speed at which your legs were walking down the hallway to the elevator.
Which sounds like science fiction, honestly.
It really does. And you would have absolutely no idea it was even happening. So today, we are opening up Chapter 5 of your cognitive psychology text, and we are going to show you exactly how your long-term memory is secretly driving your life.
It's driving your behaviors, your identity. I mean, really, it's operating entirely in the shadows.
It is. Welcome to our latest deep dive. We're speaking directly to you, the cognitive psychology student who is probably, staring down a syllabus right now.
Trying to figure out how to master all this material.
Exactly. And our mission for this deep dive is to completely unpack Chapter 5, which covers long-term memory, or LTM.
But we should clarify, we're moving way beyond just memorizing flashcards here.
Oh, definitely. To actually ace this course, you got to understand the methodologies behind the theories.
Right. It is a radical shift in perspective. When we approach the study of memory, especially in a university setting, it is incredibly easy to reduce the brain to a biological filing cabinet.
Like a transactional database.
Yes.
Yeah.
You study for your exams, you highlight the bolded terms, and you just assume you're putting the data in, and hopefully you can take the data out on test day.
But the cognitive architecture we're looking at today is, it's not a passive container at all.
Not even slightly. Without the dynamic processes of memory, you wouldn't have your experiences. You wouldn't have your relationships or your biases or your failures.
You wouldn't even be able to ride a bicycle or, decode the syntax of the sentence I'm saying right now.
Every single thing that constructs your continuous sense of self is fundamentally tied to the concepts we are analyzing today.
And if we contextualize this within the broader course, you've just emerged from Chapter 4.
Which dealt with the temporary workspaces, right?
Yeah.
Short-term and working memory.
Yeah, the mental whiteboard, that highly limited prefrontal cortex activity where you hold things for just a few seconds.
But Chapter 5 crosses a critical threshold. We are moving from that temporary maintenance into the permanent, theoretically limitless, and incredibly complex storage vault of long-term memory.
So before we can even look at how to move information into that permanent vault, we have to correct a structural misconception.
The computer metaphor.
Yes. I catch myself doing this constantly when I'm learning something new. I just think of my brain like a hard drive.
It's the most pervasive analogy in cognitive science, honestly.
I just figure I need to format the document, save the file into the right folder, and then open it later without the file getting corrupted.
But it is fundamentally flawed. Neuroscientist Chris Chatham published a really brilliant synthesis in 2007 that explicitly dismantled this hard drive metaphor.
So how does Chatham break it down? Because visually it makes sense to us.
Well, if we look at the physical architecture, computers operate using fast transistors. They route electricity rapidly, but in a highly simplistic binary manner. It's just ones and zeros.
Right. On or off.
Exactly. The human brain, however, operates via electrochemical synapses. These chemical transmissions are they're orders of magnitude slower than a silicon transistor.
So they're way more complex.
Staggeringly complex. A single neuron in your brain might have thousands of dendritic spines connecting to thousands of other neurons.
So it's creating this massive nonlinear network.
Right, a network of communication that no simple logic gate can replicate.
Okay, so we are trading raw speed for massive network complexity. But the difference that really broke my previous understanding of learning is the distinction between hardware and software.
This is the crucial part.
Because on my laptop, those are two completely different things. I have the physical machine, the motherboard, and then the software running virtually on top of it.
Saving a Word document doesn't change the physical shape of your laptop's logic board.
Right. But in the brain,
In the human brain, there is absolutely no distinction between the mechanical structure and the informational programming. The physical structure of the brain actually is the memory.
that is so wild to think about.
When you learn a new concept in this chapter, you are structurally altering the synaptic weighting and the physical receptor density of your neural pathways.
So the hardware is the software.
Exactly. You cannot separate the storage of a memory from the processing of that memory. Existing memories are actively recruited to interpret any new incoming information.
And Chatham points out something even stranger about retrieval, doesn't he?
Yes, regarding what happens when we pull a memory out.
Because if I open a text file on my laptop, read it, and close it without hitting save, that document remains completely identical to how it was before. It's totally inert.
But in the human brain, the very act of pulling a memory out of storage physically alters the biological trace of that memory.
Reconsolidation.
We call it reconsolidation, yes. The neural network is self-organizing. Because your memory is a living biological web rather than a static silicon drive, recalling a memory makes that memory trace momentarily malleable again.
Like plastic.
Very plastic. It becomes vulnerable to new information, your current emotional state, and the present context you're sitting in. When it settles back down, when it reconsolidates, it has changed.
So instead of a manila folder in a cabinet, memory is more like a vast three-dimensional spider web.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, and every time you touch a single strand to retrieve a memory, the entire web shivers. The connections literally adapt to the touch. You're never pulling out the exact same file twice.
That is a much more scientifically accurate framework. The web reorganizes because you interacted with it.
I want you to pause for a second and apply this to your own life. Think about a childhood memory that you've told 100 times at dinner parties.
Maybe a time you got lost at an amusement park.
Yeah, exactly. And over the years, you've naturally emphasized the funny parts, or maybe, exaggerated how scared you were for dramatic effect.
Which we all do.
Right. Because of reconsolidation, the act of retelling that story has physically overwritten the original neural trace. You are no longer remembering the original event.
You're just remembering the last time you told the story.
It's a little existentially terrifying, but fascinating. So this biological reality presents us with a massive functional question.
Right. If the brain is this shifting, living web, how does external stimuli, like a list of vocabulary words, actually travel from the outside world and permanently alter that web?
How do we get the fly to stick in the web so it doesn't just bounce off?
Which brings us to a foundational behavioral observation in cognitive psychology, the serial position curve.
If you've ever tried to memorize a grocery list without writing it down, you've definitely experienced this.
We all have.
You remember the first few things, you remember the last few things, and the entire middle of the list just evaporates into a black hole.
The serial position curve was famously formalized by researchers like Bennett Murdoch in the 1960s. When participants are given a sequence of items and asked to recall them in any order, a free recall task, we consistently see this U-shaped curve in the data.
And the elevated recall for the beginning of the list, that's called the primacy effect, right?
Correct. The primacy effect.
So let's look at the mechanism behind that. Why does the brain prefer the beginning? Is it just because the workspace is fresh and empty?
It comes down to the mechanics of attention and rehearsal. When you hear the first word on a list, your working memory has the cognitive bandwidth to dedicate 100% of its resources to that item.
So you begin to subvotually repeat it.
Yes, you rehearse it. When the second word arrives, you have to divide your attention, but you are still actively rehearsing the first two.
Wow.
Because those early items receive the most undivided attention and the highest frequency of rehearsal, they cross the threshold. They successfully transition from the temporary workspace of Chapter 4 into the permanent structures of Chapter 5.
Okay, so the primacy effect is actually long-term memory stepping up to the plate.
Exactly.
But as the list goes on, that working memory buffer fills up. By the time we hit the 7th or 8th item, cognitive overload sets in.
Rehearsal breaks down.
Right. There are too many items competing for limited mental resources. That totally explains why the middle of the list drops off into that black hole. But what about the sudden spike at the end? Why does the curve go back up?
That phenomenon is the recency effect. the tendency to better remember stimuli presented at the very end of a sequence. But the mechanism here is entirely different from the primacy effect.
How so?
The recency effect does not involve long-term memory at all.
Oh, wait. This connects directly back to the constraints of Chapter 4, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
The recency effect happens because those final items haven't even had time to decay yet. They are still actively echoing in the phonological loop of your working memory.
Spot on. When the researcher says go and asks you to write down the words, you don't search your long-term storage first. You immediately dump the current active contents of your short-term memory onto the page.
So the primacy effect is a measure of successful long-term encoding, while the recency effect is merely a measure of short-term maintenance.
Precisely. And those poor items in the middle, they suffered a double failure.
They didn't get enough rehearsal for long-term storage, and they were pushed out of the short-term buffer by the new items at the end.
Exactly. It's a mechanical limitation of the cognitive architecture.
I see this constantly in real life, especially at restaurants that don't print their specials.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
The waiter stands at the table and rattles off 7 incredibly complicated dishes. By the time they finish, I only remember the very first thing they said, the halibut, because I repeated it in my head, and the very last thing, the flank steak, because it's still echoing in my ears.
And everything in the middle, the risotto, the chicken, was completely lost to interference.
Completely gone. But, this entire discussion of lists and intentional memorization carries a hidden bias, doesn't it?
It does. We are exclusively discussing explicit declarative memory here, information you are consciously aware of and can state out loud.
But a massive portion of the cognitive architecture in Chapter 5 operates completely below our conscious radar.
We are stepping into the shadows of implicit memory.
And I think this is a huge misconception for students. When you're taking a class, you just assume that learning only happens when you are actively trying to learn.
You sit down with a highlighter, you furrow your brow, and you force information in.
Right. But implicit memory proves that our brains are constantly encoding complex information without our permission or even our awareness.
The most prominent subcategory of implicit memory is procedural memory. This is our non-declarative knowledge of how to perform physical or cognitive tasks.
Like walking or speaking your native language.
Or typing on a keyboard. Or the classic example of riding a bicycle. You use procedural memory to execute incredibly complex sequences of motor coordination, yet you cannot verbally explain the exact physics or muscle contractions you're utilizing to stay balanced.
Because you can't hand someone a written manual on how to ride a bike, force them to memorize the gyroscopic forces, and then expect them to hop on a 10-speed and ride away.
No, it doesn't matter how robust their explicit declarative memory of the manual is. The procedural memory trace doesn't exist yet.
It has to be learned via physical trial and error.
Heavily relying on structures like the basal ganglia and the cerebellum rather than the hippocampus.
If we look at human development, think about an infant learning to crawl, then stand, then walk. These are some of the most complex physics calculations a biological organism can make.
Yet they are efficiently learned without any conscious, explicit memory forming. You have no declarative memory of the day you learned to walk, but your procedural memory holds the blueprint perfectly.
So procedural handles our motor skills. But implicit memory also infiltrates our semantic networks, right? Our knowledge of words and concepts.
This brings us to priming.
And to understand the mechanism of priming, we have to look at how concepts are stored. They aren't isolated. They're connected in a vast network of associations.
When one node in the network is activated, that activation physically spreads to related nodes. We call that the spreading activation model.
And researchers test this unconscious spreading using word fragment completion tasks. The textbook provides a really clear example of this.
Yes. If I give you a piece of paper with the letters blank, I, B, blank, A, blank, Y, and ask you to fill in the missing letters, you have to engage in a minor cognitive search to arrive at the word library.
It takes a few seconds of mental effort. But if a few minutes before the test, I'd casually read you a sentence like, he got his materials from the shelves, checked them out, and then left the building, your brain solves the fragment puzzle almost instantaneously.
Because the underlying concepts have been primed. The sentence never actually used the words library or book.
Right, it just circled around them.
But the semantic concepts of shelves and checking out activated those specific nodes in your neural network. The activation spread, bringing related concepts to the forefront of your cognitive accessibility.
So when you saw the fragment, the word library was already neurologically warmed up.
Ready to fire.
My brain did the background prep work without asking me. And this isn't just about solving word puzzles faster. Priming can actually dictate complex physical behaviors.
Which is exactly what we teased in the opening hook of this deep dive.
Let's really analyze John Barr's 1996 study, because the methodology here is fascinating, and it completely changed how we view automaticity.
Barg and his colleagues designed an experiment to test whether implicit priming could alter physical action without the subject's conscious awareness. They recruited undergraduate students and brought them into a laboratory.
And they needed a cover story, right?
Yes, the fake reason the students thought they were there was to perform a simple language test. They had to unscramble lists of 5 words to create grammatically correct 4-word sentences.
Just a standard scrambled sentence task.
True.
Now, to test their hypothesis, they needed to manipulate the independent variable. So they divided the students into 2 groups.
The control group unscrambled sentences containing entirely neutral words.
But the experimental group,
They received words that were subtly related to stereotypes of the elderly. They didn't use the word old, but they used words like Florida, bingo, retired, and forgetful.
they were operationalizing the concept of the elderly stereotype without triggering conscious awareness.
Once the student finished the tedious unscrambling task, the experimenter thanked them, told them the language study was complete, and directed them to walk down the hall to the elevator.
But the language task was entirely a decoy.
Completely. The real dependent variable, the actual metric they were measuring, was taking place out in the hallway.
Because Barg had a confederate, right?
Yes, a member of the research team posing as a bystander, sitting secretly out of view in the hallway with a stopwatch. They recorded the exact number of seconds it took each participant to walk from the doorway of the lab to a specific piece of tape near the elevator.
And it was a double-blind setup. The person timing the walk didn't know which group the student belonged to, which prevents any experimenter bias.
Crucial for validity, and the results are what make this study a staple of cognitive psychology.
The students in the experimental group, the ones primed with words like bingo and retired, they actually walked significantly slower down the hallway compared to the control group.
Just reading words associated with a stereotype caused the motor cortex to implicitly adopt the physical characteristics of that stereotype.
But the crazy part is the debriefing phase.
Researchers always debrief participants after deception is used. They ask the students, did you notice any theme to the words? And do you think the words influenced how you behaved?
What did they say?
The students were completely oblivious. They perceived no theme, and they vehemently denied that their walking speed had changed.
The behavioral shift happened entirely outside their conscious awareness. The spreading activation from the semantic network literally bled into the procedural motor network.
It proves that our environments are constantly pulling levers in our long-term memory, influencing our behavior while our conscious mind thinks it's in the driver's seat.
It's a profound realization. However, we cannot rely on environmental priming to pass a university exam, sadly.
No, implicit memory is automatic, but explicit learning, the conscious acquisition of academic material, requires deliberate, effortful strategy.
So if you want a concept from Chapter 5 to stick permanently in your neural web, you have to understand the mechanics of encoding.
And this is where we have to fundamentally dismantle how most students study.
Because the instinct is just to maximize the amount of time spent looking at the material.
But in 1972, Fergus Craik and Robert Lockhart proposed a revolutionary framework called the levels of processing effect. They argued that the durability of a memory trace has very little to do with how long you look at it and everything to do with the depth of mental operation you perform on it during encoding.
Craik and Lockhart visualized cognitive processing along a continuum, right? Ranging from shallow to deep.
Exactly. And the shallow end of the continuum, we have structural or orthographic processing. This occurs when you focus solely on the physical, visual characteristics of a stimulus.
For example,
If you are looking at a textbook term and simply asking yourself, is this word printed in bold font or are the letters capitalized, you are engaging in structural processing.
you're essentially just staring at the typography. This is what's happening when a student blindly runs a yellow highlighter over a page without really reading the sentence.
The physical shape of the words is registered, but the memory trace it leaves is incredibly fragile. It decays almost immediately because it hasn't been integrated into the larger web.
So what's the next level down?
Moving slightly deeper, but still on the shallow end, we find phonological or phonemic processing. This is encoding based on the acoustic properties, the sound of the word.
Like asking, does this word rhyme with cat? Or does it have 3 syllables?
Exactly. You are processing it phonologically.
I used to do this all the time. I would walk around my dorm room, repeating the definition of a term out loud over and over again, treating it almost like a song lyric.
It creates an acoustic echo in the working memory, and it feels like learning because the sound becomes familiar.
But if the exam asks you to apply that concept to a new scenario, the acoustic echo is completely useless. It's still a superficial trace.
To construct a durable, highly accessible memory trace, Craik and Lockhart demonstrated that you must engage in semantic processing. This is the deep end of the continuum.
Semantic encoding requires you to process the meaning, the context, and the logical relationships of the information.
Instead of asking what the word looks like or sounds like, you evaluate its conceptual weight.
The experimental paradigm they use to prove this is brilliant in its simplicity. They would give participants a target word, like friend, and ask a semantic orienting question.
Such as, would this word logically fit into the following sentence? I met a blank in the street.
To answer that simple yes or no question, the participant's brain is forced to retrieve the definition of friend, analyze the semantic context of meeting someone in the street, and compare the two for logical coherence.
This effortful manipulation weaves the new information into the pre-existing web of knowledge. It creates multiple associative pathways or retrieval hooks.
And when they tested the participants later,
The words encoded semantically were recalled at vastly higher rates than the words processed structurally or phonologically.
because the more mental hooks you attach to a concept, the easier it is to fish it out of the dark later. And a few years later, in 1977, Rogers, Kuiper, and Kirker discovered a level of processing even deeper than standard semantics.
They called it the self-reference effect.
They found that memory recall hits its absolute peak when individuals evaluate information in relation to their own personal identity or experiences.
If the orienting question is, does this adjective describe you? The neurological activation is immense.
And the mechanism makes perfect sense. Your own life, your autobiographical memory, is the single largest, most densely connected network in your brain.
If you can link a dry cognitive psychology term to a personal memory, you are plugging a tiny string of lights into a massive power grid.
So practically speaking, as you sit at your desk studying Chapter 5, I want you to pause and monitor your own cognitive operations. If you were just rereading paragraphs until the words look familiar, orthographic processing, you are wasting your time.
You must force semantic and self-referential processing. When you read about the serial position curve, stop and actively connect it to the time you forgot half the items on your grocery list. Force your brain to do the heavy lifting of contextualizing the data.
That raises a really important practical question, though. We know that deep processing is the goal. We need to focus on meaning and self-reference. But what specific study behavior actually forces that deep processing to happen?
Because just sitting on the couch, pondering how much a psychology term relates to your personal life might not be the most efficient way to prep for a midterm.
Right. Which brings us to a phenomenon that is arguably the most critical takeaway for any student listening: the testing effect.
Also known as retrieval practice. And the underlying mechanism directly contradicts our intuitive assumptions about learning.
I know this research always hurts students' feelings because it completely invalidates the most popular study strategy in the world: reading your highlighted notes over and over again.
Rereading creates a highly deceptive cognitive trap known as the illusion of competence.
How does that work?
When you read a textbook chapter for the 4th time, the cognitive processing required to decode the words decreases. The text feels highly fluent. Your brain interprets this perceptual fluency, the ease of reading, as mastery of the material.
You say to yourself, I know this, I've seen it a dozen times.
But you haven't built retrieval fluency, you've only built recognition.
To build actual retrieval fluency, you have to engage the testing effect. The empirical evidence for this is staggering.
The earliest observations go back to Edwina Abbott in 1909, but the modern gold standard is the 2006 study by Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpik. Let's break down their methodology because the data should fundamentally alter how you study tonight.
Okay, lay it out.
Roediger and Karpik designed an experiment to isolate the variables of studying versus testing. They had college students learn educational prose passages, scientific texts about the sun, or sea otters.
And they split the students into 2 primary conditions.
The first group was the repeated study condition. These participants were given multiple consecutive periods simply to read and review the text. They engaged with the material over and over, maximizing their perceptual fluency. On average, they read the passage 14.2 times.
14 times. They must have felt incredibly confident. They probably felt like they could recite the paragraphs in their sleep.
Their self-reported confidence was indeed very high. The second group, however, was placed in a repeated testing condition. These students were only given time to read the passage an average of 3.4 times.
So what did they do with the rest of their time?
The vast majority of their experimental sessions were dedicated to free recall tests. They had to put the text away, stare at a blank screen, and struggle to type out everything they could remember. They received no feedback, just the agonizing effort of searching their own memory.
So Group A is bathing in the comfortable fluency of reading the text 14 times. Group B only reads it 3 times and spends the rest of the time engaged in the painful cognitive struggle of forced retrieval. What happens when we measure their actual retention?
The researchers tested both groups at different retention intervals. When tested just 5 minutes after the learning phase, the repeated study group actually performed slightly better. Their short-term buffering gave them a temporary edge.
Which perfectly explains why cramming right before a test sort of works, but then you forget everything the next day.
Exactly. But the true measure of long-term memory is durability. When Roediger and Karpik brought the students back 1 week later for the final test, the interaction effect inverted massively.
Here's the reveal.
The repeated study group, the ones who read it 14 times, recalled only 40% of the material. The repeated testing group, the ones who only read it 3 times but struggled through practice tests, recalled 61% of the material.
A massive statistical advantage, driven entirely by the mechanism of retrieval practice. I really want to emphasize why this works neurologically. It's called desirable difficulty.
Desirable difficulty, yes.
Every time you force yourself to retrieve a memory without looking at the answer, you are actively firing the specific neural pathways that lead to that information. The physical struggle of searching the web strengthens the strands.
If you just read the answer, the pathway isn't exercised. The difficulty of the retrieval is the exact mechanism of cognitive growth.
It shifts learning from a passive absorption model to an active reconstruction model. Testing isn't just a way to measure what you know. Testing is the most powerful tool for physically embedding knowledge into the neural architecture.
Okay, so we've put in the hard work, we abandoned our highlighters, we used deep semantic processing, and we suffered through the desirable difficulty of practice tests. The memory is successfully encoded.
Right, it's woven into the living web of our long-term memory. But encoding is only half the battle. How do we successfully navigate that web and pull the information back out when the exam is sitting in front of us?
This brings us to the mechanics of retrieval. Memories do not exist in isolation, waiting to be called upon like an alphabetical list. Retrieval is entirely dependent on pathways, and pathways are activated by associations and cues.
A retrieval cue is any external or internal stimulus that serves as a starting point to locate a specific memory trace.
The textbook uses a great, relatable scenario for this. Imagine you were trying to remember the details of a vacation you took 3 years ago. You sit there, commanding your brain to produce the memory, and your mind is completely blank.
The memory isn't gone. It's in the vault, but you don't have the right cue to activate the pathway.
But then your friend casually mentions the terrible, rattling rental car you drove on that trip.
And instantly, the mention of the rental car acts as a highly specific retrieval cue. The neural node representing that car is activated, and through the mechanism of spreading activation, the energy travels along the associative pathways.
Suddenly, a cascade of memories unlocks. You remember the mountain roads, the restaurant you stopped at, the song playing on the radio.
It's like finding a single loose thread on a knitted sweater. You pull the one thread, and the entire structure unravels. But this reliance on cues isn't random, is it?
No, there is a precise science to which cues work and which ones don't, governed by Endel Tolving's encoding specificity principle.
The encoding specificity principle states that memory retrieval is maximized when the cognitive, environmental, and emotional conditions present at the time of retrieval match the exact conditions that were present at the time of encoding.
The closer the overlap between how you learned it and how you are trying to remember it, the more successful the recall.
We experience this all the time with music. You hear a song on a random playlist that you haven't thought about in a decade. But suddenly, you are transported vividly back to your childhood bedroom, and you can almost smell the specific brand of laundry detergent your family used.
Because the song was a background condition when the original memory was encoded. Therefore, the acoustic properties of the song were woven into the memory trace itself. Hearing the song again provides a perfect matching cue.
This principle of matching conditions is so powerful that it actually creates a fascinating caveat to the framework we discussed earlier regarding deep processing.
It does.
Okay, wait. If semantic processing, focusing on meaning, is the absolute gold standard for building durable memory traces, as Craik and Lockhart proved, are you saying there's an exception to that rule?
There's an exception.
Because why do we still teach toddlers the alphabet using a catchy song? Why does the phonological rhyme in 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue stick in my head 30 years later if acoustic processing is supposed to be shallow and fragile? Is Craik's continuum flawed?
It is an excellent methodological challenge, and it was exactly the question that researchers Morris, Bransford, and Franks asked in 1977. They proposed an extension to the encoding specificity principle known as transfer-appropriate processing.
And what did their theory argue?
It posited that it isn't just about how deep you process information. It is about whether your processing strategy at encoding matches the cognitive demands of the retrieval task.
How did they operationalize that to test it?
They set up an experiment where participants encoded lists of words using either deep semantic processing, evaluating the meaning in a sentence, or shallow phonological processing, determining if the word rhymed with another word.
Okay.
Now, if they gave these participants a standard traditional memory test asking, which words do you remember? The semantic group vastly outperformed the rhyming group, confirming Craik and Lockhart.
Right, because standard memory tests demand semantic retrieval.
Exactly. But here is the brilliant twist. Morris and his team give a different group of participants a rhyming recognition test. Instead of asking, did you see the word train? The test asked, did you see a word that rhymes with brain?
Oh. They completely changed the cognitive demand of the test. What happened to the data?
The results inverted. On the sound-based rhyming test, the participants who had utilized the shallow phonological processing at encoding performed significantly better than the participants who had utilized deep semantic processing.
That is incredible. Because the test was asking for an acoustic search, the people who built acoustic pathways had the advantage. Their processing at encoding was transfer appropriate to the test.
So the depth of processing matters, but the match between study conditions and test conditions matters just as much.
And this principle of matching conditions extends beyond just internal cognitive strategies, right? It bleeds out into the physical world. The physical environment you are sitting in while you encode information actually becomes woven into the associative web of the memory trace.
Which brings us to arguably the most famous and visually entertaining study in the entire chapter. Godin and Baddeley's 1975 experiment on context-dependent learning.
I love this one.
Godin and Baddeley wanted to test if extreme shifts in environmental context would impact the retrieval of explicit memory. To achieve a radical environmental shift, they recruited members of a university scuba diving club.
Just a brilliant premise.
The experimenters had the divers learn lists of 36 unrelated words in one of two distinct physical environments, either sitting comfortably on the dry land of the beach or fully geared up, breathing through regulators, submerged 20 feet underwater.
The logistics of running a controlled cognitive psychology experiment while treading water in scuba gear is just fantastic. They're literally shouting words into a microphone that transmits to the divers' earpieces.
Quite the setup.
So we have two encoding environments, land and water. How did they structure the retrieval phase?
They used a fully crossed design. They brought the divers back and asked them to recall the words, but they manipulated the testing environments. Half the divers who learned on land were tested on land. The other half who learned on land were asked to gear up, submerge underwater, and take the memory test there.
And they did the same for the underwater learners.
Yes, half tested underwater, half brought back to dry land.
We have matching context and mismatching context. What did the retrieval data show?
The interaction effect was massive. Memory recall was vastly superior when the physical context matched. The divers who learned the words underwater remembered significantly more words when they were tested underwater compared to when they were forced to recall them on dry land.
And the opposite was true.
The exact opposite was true for the land learners. They suffered a huge drop in recall if they were tested in the water.
Let's look at the mechanism of why that happens. It's spreading activation again. When you are 20 feet underwater, the physical sensations, the pressure of the water, the cold temperature, the rhythmic sound of your own breathing through the regulator are all being processed simultaneously with the vocabulary words you are trying to learn.
Your brain inextricably links the physical cues of the environment to the semantic nodes of the words.
The environment becomes a massive multisensory retrieval cue. When you are placed back in that exact same environment, the sensory inputs activate the network. making the encoded words significantly more accessible.
But when you are placed in a mismatched environment, you are stripped of all those external cues, and retrieval becomes much more difficult.
So to apply this, look around the room you're sitting in right now. Look at your desk, your bed, your lighting. Based on context-dependent learning, the exact chair you were sitting in, the temperature of the room, the music playing in your headphones, all of it is secretly becoming part of your memory trace for Chapter 5.
Which means you need to critically evaluate your study habits. If you consistently study for your cognitive psychology exams lying sideways on your bed in your pajamas with loud music playing, but you're going to take the actual exam sitting upright at a rigid desk in a silent, brightly lit classroom,
You are intentionally putting yourself at a retrieval disadvantage.
you are creating a Godin and Baddeley mismatch. You are learning underwater and testing on dry land.
If you want to leverage the encoding specificity principle, you should try to simulate the physical and cognitive conditions of the exam room while you engage in your retrieval practice. The overlap of context is the key to unlocking the vault.
Well said.
We have covered an immense amount of theoretical and methodological ground today. Let's synthesize the major takeaways from this journey through Chapter 5 so you have a clear framework moving forward.
First and foremost, we must discard the computer metaphor. The architecture of long-term memory is not a static hard drive. It is a highly complex biological web of synapses where the hardware is the software. Furthermore, through the process of reconsolidation, every time a memory is retrieved, it is altered.
We analyzed how information enters that web through the lens of the serial position curve. The beginning of a list survives via the primacy effect, driven by active rehearsal and successful long-term encoding.
And the end of the list survives via the recency effect, which is merely the lingering echo in the temporary workspace of short-term memory.
We also explored the hidden depths of cognition, recognizing that a vast amount of our behavioral programming exists as implicit memory. This includes the procedural motor skills of the basal ganglia, like riding a bike, as well as the unconscious spreading activation of priming.
John Bargh's study demonstrated how powerfully these semantic associations can dictate our physical actions without our conscious consent.
To combat that automaticity and intentionally build explicit academic memories, we rely on the theories of encoding. Craig and Lockhart taught us that structural and phonological processing yield fragile results. We must use deep semantic processing.
And ideally, we must connect the material to our own autobiographical network using the self-reference effect.
And practically, we must abandon the illusion of competence born from rereading. Roediger and Karpicke's data definitively proves that the desirable difficulty of the testing effect, the struggle of forced retrieval, is the most potent mechanism for establishing long-term durability.
Finally, we learned that retrieval is a game of cues. Through the encoding specificity principle, transfer-appropriate processing, and the scuba diver's study of context-dependent learning, we know that our ability to recall a memory is largely dictated by how perfectly our current testing environment matches our original learning environment.
That is the structural and functional architecture of long-term memory. But as you look ahead to Chapter 6, the narrative of this course is going to take a darker turn. You are going to study memory in context.
Because memory is so heavily associative, and because it relies so heavily on shifting webs and external cues, it is inherently vulnerable. It is highly susceptible to interference, source monitoring errors, and fabrication.
In Chapter 6, you will explore the precise mechanisms of when memory goes wrong, why you might confuse a vivid dream for waking reality, or how the phrasing of a question can actually implant a false memory in a witness's mind.
The malleability of memory is its greatest strength for learning, but its greatest weakness for accuracy. Now, critical reminder before we conclude, this audio overview is designed as a learning companion.
Our goal was to help you synthesize the overarching themes, understand the experimental methodologies, and visualize the neurological mechanisms. But this deep dive is not a replacement for actively reading Chapter 5 of your textbook, taking your own notes, and engaging with your course activities.
You cannot just passively listen to us and assume the information is encoded. You have to engage in the desirable difficulty of testing yourself.
Absolutely.
I want to leave you with a final analytical puzzle, connecting back to our very first topic. Consider Chris Chatham's assertion regarding reconsolidation. The biological reality that retrieving a memory fundamentally alters its neural trace.
The web shivering and shifting every time you touch a strand.
Precisely. If that is the mechanical reality of your brain, I want you to reconsider the foundations of your own identity. The next time you vividly recall your absolute favorite childhood memory, the story you cherish the most, the one you've retrieved and retold hundreds of times throughout your life. Ask yourself,
Are you actually remembering the historical reality of the original event?
or are you simply remembering the last time you remembered it?
When